The moment Mike Pompeo launched his attack, everyone thought Jasmine Crockett would falter. But no one was ready for what came next. It started with a smirk, the kind that dripped with superiority, as if the entire room already belonged to him. He leaned into the microphone, his voice low but cutting, each syllable sharpened like a blade. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, drawing out her name as though it were an inconvenience. "Your record is thin, your accomplishments negligible, and frankly, I wonder how someone so inexperienced could possibly claim to represent the strength of this nation." The words landed like a slap, not just at her, but at everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. A few murmurs broke out in the chamber. Cameras zoomed in, some in the audience, shifted uncomfortably. But Pompeo didn't stop. He doubled down, as if relishing the sting of his own arrogance. "America," he continued, glancing toward the press gallery, "deserves leaders who have proven themselves, not individuals elevated by sympathy or tokenism. We cannot entrust our future to rhetoric without substance." For a split second, the room froze. The silence was suffocating, every eye darting between Crockett and Pompeo, waiting for the spark that would ignite the fire. She sat still, her expression unreadable, while Pompeo reclined slightly, satisfied, convinced he had cornered her. It wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attack on everything she stood for: resilience, progress, identity, and the voices of those long ignored. Somewhere in the back, a cough broke the silence, but the weight of Pompeo's words lingered in the air like smoke. This was the kind of moment that could crush a rising star. The kind of moment cynics expected to define her, a younger black congresswoman facing down a former Secretary of State, a man seasoned in the art of power plays. He had set the stage to humiliate her, yet as the seconds ticked by, something shifted. Crockett's silence wasn't defeat, it was calculation. The tension tightened like a drumbeat, the room unknowingly holding its breath. And though Pompeo believed he had already won, the truth was different. To understand why this one exchange electrified the nation, you have to know what was really at stake. In the aftermath of Pompeo's cutting words, the chamber itself seemed to tilt in his favor. Years of political clout hung over him like a crown. Former Secretary of State, West Point graduate, CIA director, his resume read like a manual of establishment dominance. To many watching, he embodied the voice of the seasoned statesman, the authority who could question, diminish, and dismiss with impunity. And in that moment, he wielded his record like a weapon. The framing was deliberate. He had painted Jasmine Crockett not as a public servant, not as a fighter for her constituents, but as a novice, someone who, in his view, was lucky simply to be on that stage. He wanted her small, boxed into a caricature of inexperience. For Pompeo, this wasn't just about a single exchange. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy where power flowed to men like him, while women like her were expected to prove themselves over and over again. Viewers watching at home felt the sting immediately. For progressives, immigrants, and everyday citizens who had struggled to be taken seriously, his words were more than politics. They were personal. The insult reverberated like an echo of a million boardrooms, classrooms, and neighborhoods where someone had been told they weren't ready, weren't qualified, weren't the right fit. Pompeo knew the script: play the elder, statesman, reduce his opponent to a footnote. And he believed the audience would nod along. But what he didn't count on was the climate of the moment. America was standing at a crossroads, where experience alone wasn't enough to earn trust. People wanted authenticity, not arrogance. They wanted leaders who carried the scars of real struggle, not just titles etched on polished resumes. The tension in that room was bigger than Pompeo versus Crockett. It was about which vision of leadership would define the future. Would it be the old guard, clinging to its credentials, or the new guard, demanding recognition not despite their background, but because of it? Crockett's stillness after his attack only magnified the stakes. She wasn't scrambling. She wasn't defensive. She was letting the weight of his words hang in the air long enough for the audience to taste their bitterness. Every second she held that silence, Pompeo's attack began to feel less like a declaration of authority and more like the desperate strike of a man guarding old power. The cameras caught everything, the flicker of discomfort in some faces on his side of the aisle, the tightening jaw of supporters who recognized the injustice, the uneasy stir of journalists sensing a moment bigger than the script. Social media was already sparking to life, with clips of his words circulating and the outrage pouring in. This wasn't just a clash of records. It was a clash of values, entitlement versus resilience, dismissal versus dignity. Pompeo wanted the debate to be about Crockett's so-called lack of experience. But for millions watching, the real debate was about whose America would prevail. The America that silences, or the America that listens, the America that excludes, or the America that empowers. And yet, as confident as Pompeo seemed, as smug as his smirk remained, there was something beneath it. A shadow that followed him into every room. A past that clung to his shoulders, heavy and unspoken. He was powerful, yes, but his confidence came from a past that few dared to question, until... Now Mike Pompeo's career was crafted to inspire awe. He was the polished product of elite institutions, the graduate who marched from West Point with discipline etched into his stride, the Harvard-trained lawyer who could outmaneuver rivals with words as sharp as blades. He wore his credentials like armor, an unspoken dare for anyone to challenge his authority. To many, he looked like the embodiment of establishment success, intelligent, commanding, untouchable. But behind that sheen of accomplishment lived something darker, a pattern of arrogance that stretched across every chapter of his career. At the CIA, critics whispered of a man who prized loyalty over truth, someone willing to bend the facts if they fit his narrative. As Secretary of State, his tenure was punctuated by moments of swagger that alienated allies and emboldened adversaries. Where others sought diplomacy, Pompeo often preferred domination, his style less about winning respect and more about demanding submission. It was a performance he had perfected over decades, project certainty, radiate confidence, and intimidate anyone who dared step out of line. That's why, in the debate chamber, he didn't hesitate to belittle Jasmine Crockett. To him, it wasn't cruelty. It was strategy, honed from years of silencing opposition by sheer force of presence. And yet, this same strategy often betrayed him. Beneath the smooth delivery lay a hypocrisy that those who paid attention could not ignore. He preached about strength while dodging accountability for policy failures. He spoke of American values while dismissing voices that didn't align with his worldview. His brand of leadership wasn't about lifting others up, it was about keeping them in their place, so his shadow loomed largest. The arrogance didn't always stay confined to closed rooms in Washington. There were public moments when his mask slipped, when his words revealed the contempt he carried for critics and opponents. A reporter once pressed him with uncomfortable questions. His response wasn't reasoned debate, but sneering disdain. It was the same pattern, replayed time and again. When challenged, he belittled. When cornered, he bullied. When confronted with truth, he deflected. For a long time, this approach worked. In the corridors of power, intimidation often passed for strength. Colleagues learned to tread carefully, allies learned to nod along, and adversaries calculated the cost of crossing him. Pompeo's confidence grew from this environment, a belief that dominance equaled respect. But America was changing. The ground, beneath his feet, was shifting. The old tactics that once ensured compliance no longer impressed an audience hungry for authenticity. The very arrogance that once solidified his reputation now risked exposing him. Viewers outside the halls of government didn't see a seasoned leader. They saw a man clinging to status, sneering at anyone who dared to rise without his permission. And so, on that stage, his attempt to frame Crockett as inexperienced wasn't just a critique of her, it was a window into his worldview. He believed credentials were destiny, that power was inherited from institutions and titles, not earned through struggle and resilience. To him, her rise could only be explained away as tokenism, because he could not fathom a reality where someone like Jasmine Crockett could match him on merit, on truth, on heart. The irony was striking. The very qualities he dismissed in her, grit, persistence, connection to people, were the ones his polished resume could never replicate. His strength looked imposing, but it was hollow, a tower built on intimidation rather than trust. And towers built on fear always tremble when confronted with courage. Pompeo believed his shadow would intimidate her into silence, but across from him sat someone whose entire journey had prepared her for this very moment. Jasmine Crockett's story was never supposed to be ordinary. It began far from the marble floors of Washington, in communities where opportunity was scarce and voices like hers were too often silenced. She wasn't handed power, she fought for it. Every inch of her journey marked by struggle, sacrifice, and an unyielding determination to prove that resilience could carve its own path through the walls of exclusion. As a young woman, Crockett quickly learned what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers, employers, even neighbors sometimes looked at her and saw limits rather than potential. But instead of internalizing those doubts, she carried them as fuel. She watched her family work tirelessly, often without recognition, and it planted in her the understanding that dignity wasn't granted by titles but by the willingness to stand tall when others wanted you bowed. Her calling was justice, and she pursued it first in the law. She became an attorney, not to chase prestige, but to fight for those who couldn't afford it. In cramped courtrooms and overlooked neighborhoods, she defended the marginalized, the poor, the voiceless, the people society preferred to forget. Each case was more than a legal battle. It was a declaration that every life mattered, every story deserved to be heard. The young attorney, with fire in her voice and empathy in her eyes, earned respect not by demanding it, but by showing up, again and again, for those who had no one else. That grassroots spirit never left her. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't with the blessing of powerful donors or elite institutions. It was with the backing of communities who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. Single mothers, working families, immigrants seeking a foothold in America. They recognized her because she had walked their path. She didn't need to manufacture authenticity. She lived it. Her campaign events weren't photo ops in polished halls, but gatherings on porches, in community centers, at rallies where people felt seen. Crockett carried with her a rare duality. She was fierce, willing to go toe-to-toe with entrenched interests, but she was also compassionate, speaking with the cadence of someone who understood the pain of exclusion. That balance made her dangerous to opponents like Pompeo. She couldn't be easily dismissed, because every attack on her inexperience only amplified the truth. Her experience was not measured in years of polished speeches or elite appointments, but in the struggles she had endured and the people she had lifted. The odds were stacked against her from the beginning. She faced systemic barriers designed to keep women like her on the margins, financial obstacles, racial bias, and political machines resistant to fresh voices. Yet each barrier became another reason to persist, and persist she did, building a reputation as someone who would not only speak truth to power, but do so with a fire that made even seasoned politicians hesitate. When Crockett arrived in Congress, some expected her to blend quietly into the background, another freshman face in a sea of seniority. Instead, she made her mark almost immediately. Her speeches were sharp, unapologetic, and laced with the raw honesty of someone unwilling to play the game as usual. She asked questions others avoided, challenged assumptions others accepted, and represented communities that had been waiting far too long for someone to call their struggles by name. What set her apart wasn't just her courage, but her clarity. She could take the most complex, layered injustice and cut through it with a single sentence that landed like a hammer. She didn't posture for applause. She spoke to awaken. And each time she stood at a podium, people in the audience, young, women, immigrants, working-class families, saw themselves reflected in her voice. This was the fire Pompeo underestimated. To him, her record looked small against his towering resume. But what he didn't see was that every line of her story carried weight heavier than any title. Her credibility came not from institutions, but from impact. Where he had commanded rooms with power, she had transformed lives with presence. Where he leaned on intimidation, she leaned on authenticity. And so as she sat across from him in that chamber, quiet after his attack, she was not rattled. She was remembering. She was carrying with her the weight of every client she had defended, every community she had stood beside, every injustice she had fought to expose. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before the reply, the breath before the storm. So when Pompeo swung at her record, he didn't realize he was striking the very core of her story, and her reply would shake him to his core. Pompeo's words hung in the air, and instead of retreating, he pressed forward with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. His smirk widened as he adjusted his microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is what concerns me, Congresswoman," he said, gesturing toward her with a dismissive flick of his hand. "You speak well, you present well, but when we examine the actual record, when we peel back the rhetoric, there's nothing there. America cannot afford leaders who build their careers on symbolism instead of substance." The room shifted uneasily. A few of his allies chuckled, nodding along as though the point had been proven. But others looked on in silence, uncomfortable, with the edge in his voice, the almost theatrical way he relished the put-down. To Pompeo, this was strategy: humiliate her, corner her, and make her look like a rookie out of her depth. To everyone else, it was beginning to look like something else: arrogance, sharpened into cruelty. Crockett, however, did not flinch. She didn't scramble to interrupt, didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she sat still, eyes locked on him, her expression unreadable. That composure was disarming. The more she refused to react, the more Pompeo leaned into his performance, mistaking her silence for weakness. "Let's be honest," he continued, his voice rising just enough to fill the chamber. "Your district could have chosen someone with proven leadership. Instead, they chose you. And while I admire ambition, ambition without results is just noise. The world doesn't take us seriously when inexperienced voices masquerade as authority." Gasps rippled through the audience. The insult was sharp, unmistakable. He wasn't just questioning her record, he was questioning her legitimacy, the very right she had to sit in that chair. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed closer, capturing every twitch of his grin, every flicker of her calm. And still, Crockett did not move. Her stillness became louder than his words. It unsettled people, even those on his side. What was she waiting for? Why wasn't she firing back? Pompeo pressed harder, sensing the need to land the decisive blow. "We cannot pretend experience. Doesn't matter. We cannot substitute passion for knowledge, and we certainly cannot gamble America's future on someone still learning the ropes. This is not a classroom. This is the world stage." By now, the audience was divided. Some were enthralled by his bravado, convinced they were witnessing a master dismantling his opponent. Others clenched their fists in frustration, hearts pounding, wishing Crockett would rise and tear his words apart. The suspense was unbearable. The longer she stayed silent, the more the tension grew, until it felt like the entire chamber was leaning forward, waiting. Pompeo smirked once more, convinced the silence was his triumph. He sat back, exuding the confidence of a man who believed he had crushed the moment. But what he and everyone else didn't see was the calculation in Crockett's eyes, the storm building beneath her calm exterior. And then, with the room holding its breath, Crockett leaned forward and unleashed a reply that Pompeo never saw coming. Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, low, almost disarmingly calm. "Mr. Pompeo," she began, her eyes locking onto his. "You've had a long career, and I respect that. But let's be clear about one thing. Experience does not equal wisdom, and arrogance is not the same as leadership." The chamber shifted. Some heads snapped up, others froze mid-breath. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was electric. Crockett's words weren't shouted, but the precision of her delivery cut sharper than any raised voice. "You say my record is thin," she continued, pausing just long enough to let the sting settle. "Let's talk about records. When I was practicing law, I wasn't sitting in high towers writing memos. I was in courtrooms defending people who couldn't afford a lawyer. I was on the ground making sure families weren't torn apart because they didn't have the money or the privilege to fight back. That's not rhetoric. That's not noise. That's reality." A murmur rippled through the audience. Crockett's calmness wasn't just composure, it was control. "And you," she said, her gaze unflinching, "you talk about results. Let's examine those results. You oversaw foreign policies that left allies alienated and adversaries emboldened. You championed strategies that many experts agree weakened America's credibility abroad. You want to question legitimacy? Fine. But let's not pretend your resume is spotless while you try to erase the contributions of those who work for justice right here at home." Pompeo shifted in his chair. His grin faltered, just slightly. Cameras zoomed in. The crowd's energy tightened like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Crockett pressed on. "You call me inexperienced because I haven't spent decades in Washington's backrooms cutting deals behind closed doors. You're right, I haven't. What I have done is stand shoulder to shoulder with the people who sent me here. I've fought for housing, healthcare, education, basic human rights that too many Americans are still denied. My record isn't thin, sir. It's thick with the lives of real people who needed someone to show up for them." She let the words hang, her eyes scanning the audience before settling back on Pompeo. Her silence this time wasn't his victory. It was hers. She was giving the room time to absorb the contrast, to weigh the human lives she represented against the bullet points on his resume. Pompeo tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand, not rudely, but firmly. "You've had your time. Now let me finish." The authority in her voice drew applause from the crowd, a rare break in the formality of the setting. "You said America can't afford leaders who build careers on symbolism. I agree. But defending the marginalized is not symbolism. Fighting for justice is not symbolism. Standing up to bullies, whether in neighborhoods or in Congress, is not symbolism. That's substance. That's leadership. And if you can't see that, it says more about your blind spots than my qualifications." Gasps erupted, followed by a swell of applause. Pompeo's face tightened, his once relaxed shoulders stiffening. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone, lowering her voice to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. "Here's the truth, Mr. Pompeo. You built a career convincing people to fear. I've built mine convincing people to hope. You've spent years tearing others down to stand taller. I've spent mine lifting people up so they can stand beside me. And history has never been kind to those who mistake fear for strength." The chamber erupted again. Applause thundered, punctuated by whistles and shouts of agreement. Even those who came undecided couldn't ignore the power in her words. Pompeo opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. His silence was deafening. His smirk had vanished. The man who had entered the room confident in his dominance now looked shaken, exposed, vulnerable. Crockett, sensing the moment, delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "You said this isn't a classroom. It's the world stage. Well, I agree. And on that stage, the world is watching to see which America we choose, the one that sneers or the one that serves. I know which side I stand on. Do you?" The roar of approval that followed was unlike anything the chamber had witnessed that day. It wasn't just applause, it was catharsis, the collective release of tension that had been building since Pompeo's first jab. The cameras captured it all. His clenched jaw, her steady gaze, the audience's eruption. And then she leaned back, her work done. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to smile. The silence of her opponent was victory enough. The silence, in Pompeo's eyes, was only the beginning, because the country was about to erupt. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words landed and Pompeo fell into silence, the debate room seemed to fracture into two realities. Inside those four walls, there was the stunned hush of political insiders trying to process what had just unfolded. But outside, across phones, laptops, and televisions, the internet had already exploded. Clips of Crockett's mic-drop counterattack spread like wildfire, cut into bite-sized highlights that could be replayed endlessly, each pause and each devastating line dissected with relish. Within minutes, hashtags surged. Got Crockett clapback, yeah Pompeo silenced, and truth over arrogance dominated. Twitter's trending bar. Users wrote in rapid fire, not just celebrating her composure, but reveling in the symbolism. This wasn't just a debate, one post read. This was every boss who underestimated you, every gatekeeper who tried to keep you small, getting humbled on live TV. Thousands retweeted it within the hour. Memes followed almost instantly. Screenshots of Pompeo's face in that frozen moment of silence were plastered with captions like, "When you realize the rookie just ended your career," in one sentence. TikTok creators remixed her words into trending audio, setting them to everything from slow-motion highlight reels to comedic skits. On Instagram, reels of Crockett's calm takedown were layered with inspirational music, framed with text like, "Dignity always defeats arrogance." Commentators joined in, some with admiration, others with shock. Progressive voices on cable. News called it a generational moment in political discourse. A well-known late-night host quipped, "Mike Pompeo came to bury her, but ended up digging his own silence." Even publications that typically gave Crockett little airtime couldn't resist covering the spectacle. Headlines blared, "Crockett turns tables on Pompeo, debate moment goes viral, silence louder than words." But what gave the moment its true power was how everyday citizens claimed it as their own. Teachers wrote about showing the clip to their students as an example of standing firm in the face of disrespect. Young women of color described watching it with tears in their eyes, texting friends, "She spoke for us." Immigrant families gathered around screens, nodding, smiling, feeling validated that their struggles had finally been echoed on a national stage. Celebrities added fuel to the fire. Musicians, actors, even athletes weighed in. One actor tweeted, "Crockett didn't just win the debate. She reminded us what leadership actually looks like." A Grammy-winning singer shared the clip on Instagram with the caption, "This is why representation matters." Each endorsement pushed the clip further into the mainstream, amplifying it beyond the world of politics into the fabric of pop culture. Meanwhile, Pompeo's silence became its own meme. The man who had built a career on commanding the stage was suddenly defined by his inability to respond. The more his allies tried to spin it, the worse it seemed. "She got lucky," one commentator on his side said, but the internet pounced, replying, "Luck doesn't trend for 48 hours straight." His defenders tried to pivot, but the narrative had already crystallized. Pompeo the intimidator, undone by his own arrogance, brought down by a calm, measured reply. It wasn't just about schadenfreude. It was about vindication. For millions of viewers who had lived through their own smaller versions of this moment, an unfair boss, a dismissive colleague, a sneering gatekeeper, Crockett's response was personal. They felt seen, validated, proud. It was as if the walls of power had briefly cracked open and ordinary people could look inside, cheering as one of their own claimed the spotlight. Days later, the energy still hadn't faded. Editorials debated what the exchange revealed about America's political future. University students wrote op-eds in campus newspapers about the cultural significance of a young black woman silencing one of Washington's old guard. Hashtags gave way to longer conversations about leadership, respect, and the kind of America people wanted to see. But what made this reply historic wasn't just the takedown, it was the universal lesson hidden inside it. In the days that followed, as the noise of hashtags and headlines slowly settled, Jasmine Crockett's words began to take on a deeper resonance. What struck people wasn't just that she had silenced Mike Pompeo in a single moment. It was that she had done it without lowering herself to his level. She hadn't matched arrogance with arrogance, nor venom with venom. She had chosen dignity over disdain, composure over chaos, truth over bluster. And in doing so, she reminded America of something it too often forgets. Strength isn't about who can shout the loudest, but who can stand the tallest when the storm hits. Crockett's reply, once replayed, revealed more than political cleverness. It revealed a principle. She reframed the confrontation as something larger than two people on a stage. It became a reflection of the country itself, a question of who America wants to be. Is this a nation defined by those who belittle and exclude, or by those who fight to ensure every voice is heard? Her words made the answer feel obvious, not just for the crowd in that room, but for millions beyond it. She spoke of service, not the kind measured in titles or years, but in the lives uplifted and communities defended. She reminded listeners that real leadership isn't about flexing power, but about protecting those who don't have any. For every family struggling to make rent, every student working 3 jobs to stay in school, every immigrant carving out a future in the face of doubt, her response was a signal that they mattered, that their dignity was worth defending. In contrast, Pompeo's attack came to symbolize the old politics of exclusion, the kind that thrives on intimidation and gatekeeping. Crockett didn't just reject it, she showed that it could be defeated. And in her refusal to play his game, she set a standard for what leadership can look like: calm, unyielding, principled. It was a lesson in how courage can be quiet and still resound louder than 1,000 shouts. The moral stretched beyond partisanship. People who disagreed on nearly everything else could find common ground in admiring her composure. It wasn't about left or right, but about right and wrong, about whether Americans would reward arrogance or recognize grace. The moment, in all its viral glory, became a reminder that politics is ultimately a mirror. And in Crockett's mirror, people saw the best version of themselves, resilient, dignified, unwilling to be erased. Perhaps that's why so many called it more than a debate moment. For teachers, it was a civics lesson. For activists, it was proof their battles mattered. For ordinary viewers, it was a spark of pride in a system that often feels broken. And for young people, especially young women of color, it was permission to believe that their voices, too, could carry weight in the halls of power. What Pompeo intended as an insult had become a gift. By trying to diminish her, he had instead amplified the values she stood for: courage, integrity, and service rooted in community. And in a time when cynicism runs deep, that felt revolutionary. And that's why this wasn't just a reply to Pompeo. It was a message to every American watching. Mike Pompeo attacked Jasmine Crockett's record, expecting her to stumble, to shrink under the weight of his authority. Instead, she rose, calm, unshaken, and sharper than anyone imagined. Her reply didn't just silence him. It ignited a fire that spread across the country. What began as an attempt to dismiss her became a turning point, a moment that reminded us all that dignity and truth can still triumph over arrogance and bluster. This wasn't just about one debate stage. It was about what kind of leaders we want, what kind of country we believe in, and what kind of future we're willing to fight for. Crockett showed that strength isn't measured by insults or power plays. It's measured by the courage to stand tall, even when the odds are stacked against you. And here's the truth. We all have a role to play in that story. Every share, every conversation, every act of standing up for what's right is part of the same movement. When we amplify voices like Crockett's, we're not just cheering. We're shaping the America we want to see. So if this moment gave you hope, don't just watch. Be part of this movement. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder that arrogance can be defeated, that truth still has power. And if you want to keep hearing stories where dignity triumphs and justice speaks louder than hate, subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll keep lifting up the voices that refuse to be silenced. Because in the end, it wasn't just Pompeo who was silenced. It was every voice of arrogance that thinks it can drown out the truth. And it's up to us to make sure that silence echoes far and wide.